If you've been following along in our lectionary the last several weeks, you might think I've picked a really bad week to start our stewardship campaign. If it's your first time visiting here, maybe right now you're thinking you've picked a really bad week to come. Because in the past couple weeks, a couple weeks ago, we had a rich man and Lazarus, and they both died, and the rich man discovered he can't buy his way to heaven. I could preach a really great stewardship sermon about that. Or we had another one where there was an unjust steward who squandered some money, and Jesus said, oh, you could use some money and some business tricks to figure out how to do this whole thing. I could probably preach a pretty good stewardship sermon about that as well. But here's the trick. I'm going to preach a sermon to kick off our stewardship campaign, and I'm not going to talk about, because I don't actually care about money. Because that's not what we're doing with stewardship. Let's think about our story today. This is a great story. There's lots of sermons embedded in this story. The first thing, it says Jesus was on his way. Jesus, remember the last couple of weeks, he's been locked in a room with some Pharisees and some disciples. They can't get along. We've been like 2 months with Jesus at this dinner party that goes on forever and people are yelling at each other. He finally breaks free and he goes on his way. It says, as he was going between Samaria and Galilee. That's the first sermon in here. Jesus was in a nowhere land. He was between home and between a hard place. Samaria was that place over there you don't want to go. And Galilee, that's the place that we want to be. And how many of us find ourselves in that borderland, that in-between place? But that's a sermon for another day. Jesus is walking along and these lepers come up. 10 lepers come up. Maybe they actually had what we consider leprosy, or maybe they had like psoriasis or itchy skin. Something was wrong with their skin that made them untouchable, unlovable, outcasts. There's a reason these 10 are in that no man's land. Jesus would have known this, and Jesus lets these folks come to him. That's the second sermon, because how many of us, when we realize there's holes in our lives and there's things that we can't do right, but we know that Jesus will accept us when we come to Jesus. But that's a sermon for another day as well. And then it seems like the focus of this passage is on this one guy who comes back. Jesus talks to them all, and he says, go see the priest. Believe it or not, that's what they did in those days when you were sick. Go see the priest. Please, if you're sick, don't come see me. I can do nothing for you. I'll pray for you. But that's what they did then, is to be considered ritually clean and healed, in order to rejoin society, in order to come back into the temple, in order to leave that no man's land and approach the holy again, you had to go to the priest. Jesus doesn't heal the people in that moment. Jesus says, go, and they go. And as they're going, they're healed. That's the third sermon, because sometimes we are called to act when we don't know that God's going to do God's part. Or at least we maybe don't feel like God's going to do God's part, but God shows up. That's another sermon for another day. So these 10 head off, and it says, as they were going, they were healed, and one of them notices, and this seems like the main character in the whole thing. This one guy notices, he's walking along, he's like, look, my hands are healed, my feet no longer hurt, that's it. And so he goes back, he falls at the feet of Jesus, praises God, giving thanks to God. And we think like this is the hero of the story. And that's the next sermon, is when we realize what God has done in our life, we can't help but give praise and thanks to him. I want y'all to come back and give praise and thanks to God here for what God has done in your life. But believe it or not, that's another sermon for another day. You may be wondering if I'm actually going to preach a sermon today. As I read this passage this week, I was struck by these other 9. Because what doesn't happen? You may say they don't come back. You may say they don't give thanks. You may say they're not grateful. But the thing that doesn't happen is Jesus doesn't take the healing away. Jesus doesn't condemn them. Because here's the shocker. Those 9 are the ones who actually did what Jesus said to do. The guy who came back disobeyed Jesus. Jesus said, go see the priest. One guy doesn't get to the priest because he comes back. The other 9, we can assume maybe they went to show themselves to the priest. And so the guy who comes back, he's a Samaritan. Jesus finds out his story. And Jesus finds out this is the guy who knew he probably couldn't even approach the priest, and so he came the only place he could. And so Jesus got to hear this story of healing. Jesus got to hear this story of reconciliation. Jesus got to hear this story of what happened in this man's life. And that interaction is like all of us here. We get to hear each other's stories. You go out, your life is transformed, and you come back and you share it with us. And that's wonderful. I love hearing that. These next several weeks, I've asked folks to come up as part of our stewardship campaign and share not how we're going to keep the light bill on, because again, I'm not worried about that right now. That stuff takes care of itself. But I want people to share their story of how their lives have been changed because of this place. And so you'll hear from the people who have come back. We'll hear from each other. But what I kept thinking about this week, and what I want all of us to keep thinking about, is what about the stories of the other 9? Who did they go and share their story with? What was their story? Maybe one of the 9 went and said, hey, there's this church that lets my soccer team use our fields. And there was a coach on that soccer team who saw something in me, and I am now the first person in my family that gets to go to college because I got a scholarship. That person is never going to come back here. But that story is part of us. Maybe one of those 9 is a teen who's entering the foster care system. And in the worst moment of transition in their life, they have nothing but the clothes on their back and a backpack full of items that were lovingly donated by a church. That person may never come back and say thank you. But that story is a part of us. Maybe one of those 9 is someone who, because a bunch of people made some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches today, will have lunch and have something to eat. Maybe one of those 9 is someone who takes 2 buses to get to a food pantry, loads up her bags and takes 2 buses to get back home, and when she gets home, she divides up her food to share with her neighbors who couldn't get there. We may not hear all these stories, but we know these stories are a part of us. Maybe one of those 9 is a mom who walked up to a priest at a festival in an open field and said, if there was a church like this when my kid was young, if there was a group of people like this when my kid was young, my kid might still be alive. We don't hear all these stories, but these stories are a part of us. And so in these coming weeks, as we hear the stories of the people who've come back and share the ways that their lives have been transformed, I invite you to listen to those stories. I invite you to think about the stories in your life. What brings you back here? Why have you returned to give thanks to God? And I want to hear those stories. But I also want you to think about those stories we're never going to hear. Because we're not just here for the stories we're going to tell each other. Those are wonderful and they're lovely. But we're here as St. Martin's, 223 South Pearson, in 2025, not for this. We are here for the stories of the world around us. of the folks who receive God's love from a community that doesn't know their name, of folks who hear of God's grace from a community that doesn't expect anything in return, for folks who know that there are people out there who see them, care for them, and love them just because they are. And so as we reflect on what this place means to us and how we want to give thanks to God for that, let's think about all those stories we won't hear. Let's think about all those lives that we know will continue to be touched. And let's think about all the ways that the good news, the great news, the gospel news that we know here can change the whole world. Amen.